Hi, I'm Chuck Dorsett for Weaver Leather Supply, and this is the Leather Element. If you've got a good question for us or a good idea for a Leather Element, drop it in the comment box below. Also, if you want to know when our videos release, just click your notifications. You'll know exactly when these come out. So applying antiques, we get a lot of questions on this. We use antique in a couple of our videos, but I don't go into great detail. We're more concentrating on the project than we are the antique. Well, let's start from scratch. Now, if you're new to leathercraft, keep this in mind. Before I started with Weaver, I never used antiques. The few that I tried simply didn't do what I thought they should. I would apply, wipe off, and they're gone. Well, then I joined Weaver and started using the Fibings antique finish. World of difference. Now I have to restrict myself from using antique on every project because it does so many things for us. Well, let's jump to the back side of the table. Let's get started, see what these can do. The primary job of an antique is to sink into the natural blemishes, the range marks on a piece of leather. So therefore, a new project looks used and loved. Well, the added benefit, and in fact, my favorite part of an antique, is that it's really going to make our stamping and tooling stand out. Even our groove line is going to stand out. Now, there are two ways to go. We're going to look at both, but we're going to start with my favorite. Now, we're going to use an undyed piece of leather. Can we use antique on this? Absolutely. How about a top coat? Yes, we can. The antique, it's going to add just a hint of color, but more than that, it's going to stick down into our stamps. So let's start right here. To me, just my opinion, but to see antique wrapping around on the back of a project looks terribly unprofessional. So let's tape off our back before we add our antique. Now, on this piece, I've edged this front and back so that we can round, we can slick our edges. So therefore, we've got a rounded edge. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drop my tape just on the inside of that rounded edge. So therefore, we're going to have antique on our edge. And we can use most any tape. Antique's not going to wick like dye will. So let's tape the back of this, both sides, right up to our edge. Good. So now we've got good tape on the back of this. Now we're going to go with a natural veg tan. Typically we would dye, then add our antique. And there's some cool ways we could go with that. We'll circle back around to that. But we're going to go with a natural veg simply so we can see exactly what our antique is doing. Now this can be a mess. It's the last stop in my shop for rags, paper, and gloves. So let's definitely use some gloves. And we're covered. Good. Now we're going to apply this two different ways. So I like to take some of my antique and put it on our pattern sheeting. Now we can use scrap leather here, but what I find is the leather is going to wick the moisture out of the antique. We don't want that. So the pattern sheeting going to work nicely. So our first step, let's take a rag. Now we're going to apply this across the top grain. Then we're going to come back and fill in, because as long as we get good coverage here, this isn't going to get any darker as we apply more antique. So let's start right here, get some antique on our rag, and I'm going to work my way down. And then let's take a second rag and let's wipe away from the direction we're moving. And we can come back down if we want to, but like I said, once we hit this with a coat, it's going to stay pretty much where it is. Well, it doesn't look great, does it? What a mess, okay? Well, let's come back in with a dauber. Now let's fill in our stamped areas as well as our groove line. Notice right here, that's going to look good once we add our antique. Yeah, there we go. That is looking good. And actually, I like the color here on the natural veg. Okay, our edges, still a mess? Well, let's antique our edges. We've got that. Now let's jump back over and let's wipe some of that off. Let's do the same thing on the other side. And we've got the other side. Let's wipe that down. Then come back across the face. Clean that off a little bit. There we go. Looking better, and it actually looks antiqued. Now, don't hesitate. Like right here, if we're a little bit light with our antique and some of our stamp designs, it's no issue. Come back in, because again, our top grain isn't going to get any darker. Well, there we go. That absolutely looks antiqued. Very happy with that. Is there a difference between this and our original? Absolutely there is. A world of difference. So now let's give this about 45 minutes. Let that antique dry, then we'll add a top coat. We've got about half an hour, maybe a little bit more in dry time. Now let me back up. There are two things I didn't mention. We're using the medium brown antique. Well, we're going to come back around to this and we're going to look at all 6 colors, but also a few additional possibilities. But secondly, when I clean off the antique, I want to go with more of a cotton rag. Something like a fleece is going to remove too much of the antique. But again, that's your call. We don't want this consistent. It's an antique. But now when I'm going to add my top coat, I do want to go with something like a fleece simply because it holds enough top coat to do most projects. So let's add our leather balm. And back across. Now let's give that just a few seconds. Let that leather balm wick in and dry. Good, just about 15, maybe 20 seconds there. So now let's take a soft cotton rag and let's buff this. All told, that is beautiful, but let's do this. We want to make sure this doesn't rub off. So let's take our leather balm and let's hit our edges and wipe those off. In fact, by doing that, we're actually starting the process of slicking our edges. Good, there we go. Last step, let's take our tape off. Well, good. There we go, nothing wrapping around. Very professional, very clean, nice. Okay, let's go a different route to apply our antique. Now we're going to add a top coat. Then we'll add our antique and then a top coat again. To me, this is going to give us less color across our top grain, but it's going to more emphasize our stamps or our tooling designs. So let's start with our leather balm. Add a top coat first. Good. Let's give that about 15, maybe 20 seconds. Let that dry where it is. We've given this a few minutes, so let's buff. Good. We've got a nice top coat on this. So now, let's give that maybe 15, 20 minutes. Let's make sure that top coat's dry. Our top coat had a little time to dry, so let's jump back over and we're going to do exactly the same thing. Let's apply with a rag and then come back with our dauber. And let's wipe that off. Yes, we've got much less color, much less antique on the top grain. So let's come in with our dauber. Well, that looks good thus far. So now let's jump over, hit our edges. Well, that looks good thus far. So now let's give our antique about 30, 45 minutes dry time. Then we'll come back in, make one more pass with our top coat. And again, more dry time, but absolutely worth it. So our antique's dry, our top coat below that is dry. Let's come in with one more pass of our top coat, sparingly. And let's give that 15, 20 seconds, let it dry. And now let's buff. Well, again, I love the look of that. So all told, we could go either way. If we want a little less darkening overall, let's add our top coat first. But right here, I love that look too. Okay, let's reset. We're going to get a look at each of the 6 basic colors, then we're going to get creative. Now, I said 6 basic colors, but technically, we've got 5 basic colors. Same colors we've always had. White, medium, dark brown, black, and mahogany. But now we have a neutral antique, and we're going to talk about that. So we've got our light brown. I'm going to add the remaining 4 colors to our swatches here, but I'm going to do that without adding a top coat first because I want to see how much each one is going to darken my leather. Because when we're planning a project, we need to determine the combination of our antique and our dye, so we don't get our dye too dark or the overall project too dark. There we go, we've got our 5 basic colors. Now my big hope here is that this will save us a little time and a little money trying to figure out which antique we like best. Well, I like the mahogany. Gives us a hint of mahogany, but it really does make our stamp design stand out. The black, that hits hard. Any dye we drop this on is going to go very dark on us, so we've got to take that into account. Light, medium, and dark brown. Well, the light brown, it doesn't really do much, whereas opposed to the dark brown. Well, we've got a little bit of a darkening on our top grain, but that hits pretty heavy right there. The medium brown, my all-time favorite. I feel like I get the best of all worlds with this. I don't have a lot of darkening on my top grain, but it really sticks deep into those stamp impressions and designs. That is my all-time favorite. Okay, so let's reset one more time. I'm going to dye both of our sample straps here. Let's add a neutral antique, see what happens there. I had an extra strap, so let's go with 3 colors here. We've got our Pro Dye red, black, and light brown. Now, a neutral antique. This simply means we can mix this with any one of our Angelus paints. We don't have to stick to the 5 basic colors anymore. We can make just about any color antique we want. And we've got over 60 Angelus paints. In fact, right here, one of my favorite combinations. This is the Pro Dye black, a leather balm top coat, and our neutral antique with a turquoise paint. One of my all-time favorites. Okay, so here's where I get the majority of the questions. How do we mix this? What ratio do we use? And I'm sorry to say, I don't have a good answer here. I'm looking for about a 6 or 7 to 1. 6 or 7 antique to 1 paint. Now, if we think about it this way, the more antique, the less color. The more paint, the more color. So let's do this. Let's drop in a blue antique on our light brown strap. So let's start right here. I've got just a piece of scrap leather. Now we're working on a smaller project here, so we need to take quantity into account. But I'm going to go about right there. So we've got a little bit more than a smudge. So with our paint, and I should put gloves on because I'm going to have this all over me. So let's just daub out about 5 brush loads of paint. Okay, so there we go. Now let's mix this together. Now I would say, if we're going to work on a project where we've put a lot of time into tooling or stamping, let's experiment before we go to our main project. So let's mix this up. Well, I think that's about as mixed as I can make it. So now I'm going to put some gloves on and we're going to apply this just like we did the other antiques. So let's see what our blue antique does to our brown. Well, it certainly darkened our brown a little bit, but it's a beautiful color and we can definitely see that blue. Now, I don't know if I'd like to drop in a top coat first, then antique, then top coat, but let's give this a little time to dry. I'll add a top coat, we'll see how it looks. In that time, I'm going to add, let's go with our gold on our red. How about a purple on our black? Let's see how that works. These are dry and they look good. We've got a top coat. Now the purple on the black. Didn't really expect that to pop, but it's a nice nuance of a color. I bet in the sunlight we can absolutely see that. But I almost feel like maybe I need a little more purple in the mix. Blue and brown, one of my favorite combinations. I was a little worried because this went dark when we applied the antique. But as it dried, it lightened up to a really pretty color of brown. But right here, the antique, it's acting just like an antique should. It's inconsistent, used and loved. That's what we're looking for. Now over here, that really makes that design stand out and pop. But also, notice our groove lines on both of those. That's a nice touch. There's so many ways we can go with the neutral antique. So pick up whatever color, experiment with it, see what happens. No telling where you're going to go. Now there's one more point, and then I promise I'm going to stop talking, but it's a valid point. So most of our holes, our oblongs, our round holes, these are all punched before we dye antique and top coat. Well, my chisel holes, I want to punch these after we dye antique and top coat. Here's why. So with most of these holes, as we apply antique, that antique's going to get down into these holes. Well, they're easy enough to clean out, say on oblongs or round ends. We could use a Q-tip or even a piece of lace, run it through there. That'll clean that out. But if we chisel before antique, what's going to happen is when we add antique, it's going to get down into every one of those chisel holes. So when we're sewing, every time our thread goes through a hole, it's going to pick up antique and it's going to be a mess. So if we do our chisel holes after dye antique and top coat, then we completely alleviate that problem. It is not an issue. Well, I feel like we've covered antiques from one end to the other. But the bigger point here, we can use antiques to highlight our work, or we can use them to add a whole new level to our projects. I hope this is good information for you. Thanks for taking time to watch The Leather Element. Good luck with your projects.